Hello, and welcome to the Mathematicians Podcast, the podcast where we explore the fascinating stories behind the figures that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we are looking at Chrysippus. Chrysippus, the man, the myth, the logician. If ancient Greece were a pub quiz team, Chrysippus would be the one in the corner with 5 pens, 2 notebooks, and absolutely no patience for your guess that the capital of Thessaly is probably Sparta. He's the guy who insists on clarifying every question, correcting the host's grammar, and explaining why the phrase true or false is logically insufficient. And yet somehow you still want him on your team, because when the lightning round hits and the question is, which philosopher formalised the logical consequences of conditionals using an early propositional calculus, he's your guy. And if you don't want him on your team, well, that wouldn't be very logical. But more on that later. When I was a younger man, I used to drive an ice cream van. It was an old rust-checkered Ford Transit with a tinny speaker that played Greensleeves in the key of existential dread. I say drive loosely. It moved in much the same way tectonic plates do, slowly, unpredictably, and with a tendency to ruin people's pavements. On hot days, I'd park it outside the local outdoor swimming pool. Always a prime spot, full of sunburnt kids with sticky coins and parents teetering on the brink of despair. They'd queue up under my faded Whippy Ice banner, which was always peeling off at one corner, like it too had just about had enough. As I handed out 99s, rocket lollies, and the occasional unlabelled experimental frozen lump of possibly mango, possibly regret, I'd overhear snatches of conversation, arguments about football, speculation about the neighbours, at least one daily debate about whether ice cream counts as a meal. And I realised something. People love to argue, even over things that absolutely do not matter. It was in that unlikely crucible of overheated patience and melting sherbet that I encountered logic, not in the formal sense, but in a very human desire to make a point, even when that point is about why Darren from number 42 is categorically wrong about how to pronounce Solero. One day, a small boy, no more than 5, with a haircut that looked like it had been negotiated rather than styled, asked me if his ice cream could have nuts on top. Before I could answer, his mum swooped in like a hawk and said, "No, darling, remember you can't have nuts, you're allergic." He frowned. "But I want nuts." His mum, already pink-faced from sun and stress, crouched down and said, "Yes, you want nuts, but if we give you nuts, then you might end up in hospital, so we can't." He frowned harder, like a small logician being presented with his first paradox. "But I like hospital." Now, it's at this point that I, the purveyor of frozen joy and de facto mediator of philosophical quandaries, found myself chiming in with, well, wanting something doesn't always mean you should have it. If eating nuts makes you ill, and you don't want to be ill, then you probably don't want nuts. And he nodded, sort of, and picked sprinkles instead. His mum mouthed thank you like I'd just pulled him from a burning building. That exchange stuck with me. Not because I solved anything, but because of how natural the structure of it was. It was pure propositional logic, right there on a scorching tarmac afternoon. If P, then definitely not Q, so let's go with R instead. It was only years later, reading about Chrysippus and his work with logical conditionals, that I realised he would have approved of that moment. Not the sprinkles, necessarily, but the reasoning. Chrysippus believed that our judgments and actions could be traced through chains of logical consequences, even when ice cream and anaphylaxis were involved. Now, fast forward a couple of decades, and here I am, no longer wielding the noble flake, but instead sitting behind a microphone, talking about the likes of Chrysippus and the ancient Stoic who formalised exactly this kind of reasoning, albeit without quite so much raspberry drizzle. Chrysippus understood that human beings are wired to make sense of the world through structured thought. He took the chaotic mess of opinions, impressions, and emotional noise and gave it brackets, connectives, and consequences. He probably would have made a very competent ice cream man. No nonsense, exact change, and if it melts, then it drips. So today, as we look at the life and logic of the man who turned arguments into an art form, Spare a thought for the quiet dignity of that overheated van and the humble scoop that first introduced me to deductive reasoning. Because if a man can't find philosophy in the bottom of a cone, then where can he? Born around 279 BCE in Soli, modern-day Turkey, Chrysippus found himself smack in the middle of the intellectual frenzy that was Hellenistic Greece. By the time he arrived in Athens, the city was still feeling the aftershocks of Plato and Aristotle's philosophical mic drops. He joined the Stoic school, which at the time was under the direction of Cleanthes, himself a former boxer, so yes, early Stoicism involved both punching and punchlines. Chrysippus, not the founder, but certainly the champion of Stoicism, he was the guy who saved Stoicism from intellectual obscurity. Without him, we might not even remember it today. In a way, Chrysippus was the franchise reboot nobody asked for, but everybody needed. He reportedly wrote over 700 works, though, plot twist, almost none of them survived. Which means historians are left piecing together the intellectual equivalent of a 3,000-piece jigsaw puzzle where 2,995 pieces have fallen down the back of the sofa. And just to give you a taste of the man's personality, he once claimed, if the gods use dialectic, they use none other than Chryssippian kind. Which is either the most confident statement in philosophical history or the earliest recorded instance of a humble brag. Okay, so let's talk logic. If you've ever been subjected to an if A then B argument, congratulations, you've been touched by the ghost of Chrysippus. Not the first to introduce formal logic, that's Aristotle's claim to fame, but he turned it into a high-speed analytical machine. Aristotle's logic was all about categories, think syllogisms, like all humans are mortals, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Which is great if you're making quantitative statements about existence or universality. But Chrysippus, he was a bit more pedantic. He focused on propositional logic, statements connected by logical operators like if, and or. If Aristotle's logic was about what you're saying, Chrysippus cared about how you're saying it. One of his favourite logical forms was the modus ponens. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. It's the foundation of modern logical systems, including the fundamental level of computational language. If you've ever coded an if-then statement, then you owe a tip of the hat to our guy Chrysippus. But he didn't stop there. He also formalised modus tollens. If P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Here you will notice the logical equivalence between if P then Q and if not Q then not P, which in today's language we would call the contrapositive. For Chrysippus, logical consistency was a way of life. He even argued that the cosmos itself was governed by rational principles, which is basically the ancient Greek version of believing the universe runs on Python scripts. Clearly, however, we can say if the universe was run on Python, then there would be a float point error in fundamental constants. Well, hang on, given that there are float point errors in fundamental constants, can we conclude that the universe runs on Python? Careful now, because this would be an error of affirming the consequent. If P, then Q, Q is true, therefore P is true. This is difficult to decipher as a fallacy, especially when read out by a handsome mathematician with a confident-sounding voice. So let us explore with another example. If my daughter eats all her vegetables, then she is allowed ice cream. What can I conclude from seeing my daughter eating ice cream? Nothing, because she's a master of manipulation, and regardless of the status of the broccoli, if she wants the ice cream, then there is a higher than usual chance that ice cream shall be forthcoming. Or another, there is an exchange in Catch-22 where the sergeant harasses the chaplain over a letter saying, "Look, the author signed his name." But that's my name there. "Then you wrote it! QED!" We should point out here that anyone saying QED out loud can largely be ignored. Much like with Aristotle, where we explored all of the different options available for a syllogism, we can also consider all the ways we might combine two statements. and for this we can use a truth table. A truth table begins with columns for the propositions. Here we might consider 2 columns with A and B, and then we can give 4 rows below A and B with the statements of true or false for each. Giving only 2 propositions, this allows for 4 distinct states. Both statements are true, only A is true, only B is true, or both propositions are false. From this initial set of states, we can consider what possible connections of A and B are possible and when they might be considered true or false. Given that there are now 4 distinct states, each of which should yield either a true or false compound proposition, we can expect 2 to the 4 possible connectors of A and B, or 16 distinct ways to say that A and B are connected. I will try to list them, and you can draw your own truth tables at home to check the working. The first batch of 4 connections are more like non-connections, as they ignore one input and rely solely on a single proposition. These are unary operations, and you might call these either a projection or a negation of A or of B. So we have A and ignoring B, which just mirrors A, B and ignore A, which mirrors B, not A and ignore B, which just reverses the truth table of A, and not B and ignore A, which reverses the truth table of B. The next 2 connections are independent of both inputs and are arguably not proper connections. So these are the tautology, and that is just always true, doesn't matter what A and B are, we always give a true statement. And then contradiction, which is just always false, regardless of the inputs A and B. So that is 6 statements so far, combining A and B, and these are the boring/trivial ones. Let's get into the more interesting propositional connectors now. So the next set, we make use of the words and or. So we could have A and B, which is true when both A is true and B is true. A or B, which will be true for all true A's or all true B's. A XOR B, which is X or B, and this is the exclusive disjunction, and it's satisfied if either A is true or B is true, but not when both are true. A NOR B, that is neither A or B, which is logically equivalent to not A and not B. A NAND B, which is not A and B, but true for all of the other cases. And then we have the implication connections. So we have if A then B, if B then A, and if B, which if you can't translate what I'm saying, that is IFF, a double F if. So this is the A if and only if B, which is equivalent to B if and only if A. Although we actually write this structure with the operator XNOR, which is the exclusive not or. Then we can have the non-implications, which again are actually structured better using the AND operator. So we could say if A then not B, this is the non-implication, and we would say that is A and not B, or if B then not A, which is B and not A. Oh, goodness me, that was the longest list of 16 things I think I've ever read. If you're wondering where the terminology comes from, I'm afraid I must disappoint you, because this was not Chrysippus. This summary has come from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which admittedly sounds like it could have been any ancient Latin writer, but was actually penned by Wittgenstein in 1922. And if we ever get that far, I would love to explore the maths of Wittgenstein in more depth. Of course, Chrysippus wasn't just a logic nerd, he was also the philosophical backbone of Stoicism. And while you might associate Stoics with calmness and emotional control, the original Stoic philosophers were not just glorified mindfulness influences. At its core, Stoicism is about aligning yourself with nature and reason. In other words, control what you can, accept what you can't, and avoid rage tweeting. Chrysippus expanded on this by tying Stoicism to a concept called determinism. According to him, everything that happens is the product of a rational chain of cause and effect. So, if you are late for work, blame the cosmos. Now let's take a deep breath and unclench our fists, because this is not me sneaking in non-mathematical content. The view of a deterministic universe lies at the heart of mathematical inquiry, and it's a sincere contention between pure mathematicians and mathematical physicists. Most physicists, citation needed, do not believe in a deterministic universe. There are quantum fluctuations that are inherently statistical and random, at least based on our current theories, and this makes calculating the path of any individual particle impossible. We might refer here to the uncertainty principle, which loosely states that you can know where something is or how fast it's travelling, but not both at the same time. But the world of mathematics is deterministic, in that we only assent to things that are known and demonstrated, which is why the Goldbach conjecture is still something we all believe to be true, but none of us can say that we know. In case you haven't heard, the Goldbach conjecture states that every even number can be written as the sum of two primes, and we're all fairly sure that that is true, and we've tested it up to billions of billions of billions, but we've no idea. There's no proof yet. But then, if there is a possibility of a truth to be known, just not reached by us yet, what about an all-knowing God? Or, as the Stoics might suggest, what can be known by the wise sage? Perhaps we can assume that the Goldbach conjecture is knowable, just not by us. But maybe God would know. Maybe God has the counterexample, the number that can't be written as the sum of two primes. Or maybe God knows that it's true for all numbers because God can actually count to infinity. So far, no one has thought to ask him. But if God can know that, surely he might also be able to know about the paths of quantum particles. So the question remains, is the universe deterministic? Perhaps I could return to being a little bit more philosophical again and say, if the universe is deterministic, how does that affect morality? Well, again, plot twist, because Chrysippus also believed in what we would now call compatibilism. Even though the universe is deterministic, humans still have moral responsibility, because our reasoning capacities allow us to assent or withhold assent to external impressions. It's the philosophical equivalent of saying, sure, life is pre-scripted, but you still get to either enjoy your evil deeds or detest them. And now the part you've been waiting for, the death of Chrysippus. It's the stuff of legend. Specifically, a really weird legend. According to Diogenes Laertius, Chrysippus died from laughing too hard at a drunk donkey eating figs. Yes, you heard that right. The man who dedicated his life to cold, rational analysis, the Stoic that we know, was done in by an ill-timed giggle fit. But there's something fitting about it, isn't there? Here's a philosopher who believed the entire universe was tightly ordered, a rational system, and his own demise was the result of cosmic irony. So, what's Chrysippus's legacy? Well, for one thing, modern logic owes him a massive debt. He wrote the language for propositional calculus, the same system that underpins computer programming, AI, and every if-then decision you've ever made in your life. His ideas on determinism and free will still drive debates in philosophy and neuroscience. Are your actions preordained, or do you have a choice? For Chrysippus, the answer was P and Q. Even his approach to contradictions, what philosophers might call the liar's paradox, foreshadowed key developments in 20th century logic, including Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And honestly, the idea that reason governs the universe feels more relevant than ever. Whether you're debugging a program or trying to make sense of global chaos, Chrysippus' message still holds. Think clearly, stay consistent, and maybe don't laugh too hard at donkeys. So that's Chrysippus, logician, Stoic, and possibly the only philosopher to die of stand-up comedy. Without him, Stoicism might have faded into obscurity. Without his logic, our modern world would look very different. And if, and only if, nothing else, let his life remind you that even the most serious thinkers can have a sense of humour. Because when the universe throws you a cosmic joke, sometimes all you can do is laugh. So join me next time on the Mathematicians podcast, where we will be needing an even bigger piece of paper and even more string. It's time to tackle Apollonius. We will be going past the apex to the other side of an inverted conic with one of the most intimidating figures I've had to research so far. If you can't wait to hear from me between now and next week, then you can follow me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod, where every now and then I will share something cool that I found. Also, check out the new chat show on YouTube at Unnatural Numbers. That's un-natural numbers, where I will be joined by some great guests to talk about our favourite facts about a single value. And of course, you too are invited to participate in that show as a guest on a future episode. Whilst you wait, see if you can sit quietly in a room without speaking, eating, or opening your eyes for 7 whole days. Until then, goodbye! The music today is Dance Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.